Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this webinar on best practices in EUC governance. There's been a lot of recent regulatory commentary on end-user computing, tools and calculators around the model inventory. The idea of today's webinar and two subsequent webinars we will be recording is really to take people through some of the best practices we see in the marketplace and some of the experiences we've had. For those who don't know me, my name is Henry Umney. I'm the Managing Director of GRC Strategy at Mitratech, with over 30 years of experience in providing solutions in the financial marketplace, and also over 15 years of working in the EUC space as a specialty. I'm very glad to be joined today by Igor and Chris from EY and Rabobank. Maybe, gentlemen, we could do some introductions. Igor, maybe with yourself first, please.
Thank you, Henry. Igor Prezant, Managing Director with Financial Services Risk Management Practice. My focus primarily on enterprise risk and controls. One of the hats I'm wearing is I'm leading end user computing offering. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Igor. And Chris?
Thank you, Henry. So Chris Caswell, I am currently the Head of Business Development and In Control for Markets in London. Amongst a number of initiatives that are under my remit. Over the last few years, I've been responsible for implementing an end user computing framework in the markets environment globally, including functions like trading, sales, the traditional trading floor. Thank you for your time today.
Brilliant, Chris. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me, and looking forward to this and the subsequent webinars. I guess just as by way of introduction, end-user computing risk I always describe as one of the sort of best understood but least addressed risks within organizations. And I think what we've seen, as I said earlier, is, and we'll come on to in a second, is there has been a lot of regulatory focus on this. And really what the webinar is about is really trying to understand what the regulator is saying, and to understand how firms can codify that into policies and getting alignment within their organization to ensure that the correct visibility and controls are in place. So I mentioned the recent regulatory focus. So back in 2019, there was a report, the supervisory report from the Fed, which was very complimentary to financial institutions in terms of having massively strengthened the balance sheets, and therefore the financial risks were being very well monitored post-financial crisis. However, what they did highlight was that over 60% of the people that they supervise had a number of non-financial failings, and they highlighted a number of elements around failings in the model risk management, some in the IT risk management, and also failings around reg reporting. Subsequent to that, in August, the OCC released the Controller's Model Risk Handbook, which really was clarifying a lot of the regulations that have been issued since the financial crisis, and within that clarification around the model risk management, it started to really hone in on the quantitative models, the tools, calculators, and EUCs, and that has subsequently resulted in fines in the marketplace for US institutions. And what we see, this is not just in the US, but it seems in the UK we're following a similar path. Late last year, there was a Dear CEO letter really highlighting, funnily enough, almost exactly the same shortcomings that the Fed had highlighted, but specifically also calling out that spreadsheet management, that EUC management failing. And again, at the end of last year, 2 banks were fined specifically for having some of those spreadsheet failings. So this, as I said, EUC risks, the fact that we have key processes being run outside of IT's control is not something that is new, but it's certainly something that as I said, is getting more and more of the regulators' focus, and therefore we're starting to see more and more firms coming to us who have never addressed this risk before, and really trying to get a handle on it. And the idea of today's session and the next two is really to give people some benefit of the experience, really, of Igor and Chris, and where possible, we can tell you how the technology that Mitratech provides is able to support some of the controls that and the frameworks that Igor and Chris are going to describe. So really, the starting point of any addressing any risk is defining those parameters, I guess, terms of reference. So really, Igor, maybe if I could hand to you, and maybe you could describe, how do we sort of frame what is this EUC risk that we're looking to mitigate?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Henry. So when we think about the EUC controls, the EUC risk, right, the foundational elements within the framework should be really the definition, because quite a few of our clients trying to figure out what an EUC is, what EUC isn't, etc., and where would that specific object fall on the spectrum from IT application to EUC to model, etc. So the way we try to think about it is really along a couple of different dimensions. On its most basic, on its most foundational level, any technology capability that's been developed by the organization is really, it can be two types, right? One, whether it was developed by IT, so in other words, whether it was developed, in compliance, subject to system development lifecycle, various checkouts, system checks, integration checks, etc., or not, right? So whether it was developed by the end user, someone in trading and operations, etc., who had a certain business challenge, so they had to deal with this business challenge, and the way for them to overcome it would be to develop the functionality. Historically, a lot of this functionality was developed within Excel, but what we see more and more is this functionality being developed through some other file types, etc. So when we think about the definition, we're really not trying to position it as a spreadsheet risk management, because right now concept is much broader than just exactly a spreadsheet. But on its most foundational level, whether that object was developed by IT or not, it would still represent the same, inherent risk types. Whether the object was developed correctly, so whether the formulas were used, whether the formulas work, whether the data inputs, etc. So the focus is on the structure, on the coding, and then the other spectrum of risk is the operations, whether the change management process is in place, whether the access controls, business continuity, etc. So when we go back to the definition, we try to define the specific parameters. One, that it needs to be developed using the widely available capabilities. Again, traditionally it's spreadsheets, but now it's more and more developed outside of system development lifecycle. But then there are also a couple additional attributes that would help organization to narrow down the scope. So in other words, whatever the capability is being developed, it really needs to support ongoing and periodic existing process. So it shouldn't be one-off, and that the focus really should be on specific key uses. And we'll talk about key uses in a minute. But the whole premise behind it is try to come up with a view that really differentiate something that results in significant risk versus something that's benign and might be managed outside of the specific EUC governance structure. And we'll talk about it probably in a minute.
Igor, I would just like to echo everything you've just mentioned, but I think there's a horizontal matrix that you have to consider when you're defining what is an EUC. The definition today, as you've just mentioned, are all around the kind of tools and software applications that you can use and that you want to monitor. But for us, it may be a very simple spreadsheet, but you may want to define at the time, at policy level, regulatory impact, operational risk impact, because these drivers, they may be very simple tools that you may not want to put into an application, or you don't have budget to put into an application, but they have a significant impact external to the organization or even internally on reg reporting. So I just want to emphasize, and I think we're going to discuss that in a moment, the horizontal impact of defining what an EUC is. And I think it's very important to do that up front.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Chris. I think, Igor, again, to echo some of the points you've made, EUCs in the past were just spreadsheets and access databases. Most graduates that come out of university now, are very skilled in coding, and they look to some of these other technologies which they've used at university to be able to create these applications, as I say, outside of IT's control. So it is important that the definition, as you say, is wider. But I'd also pick up on Chris's point that and which we will come on to, I think, in the third session, which is what we need to do is understand, though, that there isn't budget in place, and therefore this functionality is being created by end users and outside IT's control. But we should, at the right time, be looking at what is that decommissioning plan. So what is that, getting to that life cycle of moving those higher risk EUCs into formally IT controlled applications. The one point I will call out also, Igor, which you didn't cover on here, which is models are defined in an MRM policy. So EUCs, and I think this is an interesting one. We have got clients that have EUCs covered by both an MRM policy and an EUC policy. The EUC policy is there really to cover some of the IT controls that are not typically considered in an MRM policy. So it is a bit of a grey area. I don't know. I mean, you've been very matter of fact on this. I don't know if there's anything else you'd add to that point.
Andrew, you're absolutely right. There is a range of practices. Some of the organizations would treat models, right? So without going into too deep of a definition what a model is, right? That's something that has certain uncertainty. If you step back and start thinking about deterministic versus probabilistic outputs, and you go through the decision tree whether an object is a model or not, what we've been discussing, what we see works well for the organization, if there is a very clear definition between the governance and the control structure that's applicable to models versus applicable to EUCs, with full appreciation that some of the organizations might look at controls related to the uncertainty within the MRM framework, and then they pivot to EUC framework for the rest of the controls, including IT general controls. We're definitely seeing that in the industry. However, what we see now, there's a certain movement on building clear delineation. We probably can touch upon the ownership of the EUC governance framework as well. And what we see currently in the industry, there is a certain shift, right, from the time where, a certain period ago when EUCs, we would find them traditionally somewhere within the IT risk management, then we would see movement to operational risk management. And what we see now, that quite a few model risk organizations are picking up EUCs as part of their governance. But even within those organizations, quite often we see delineation, whether it should follow MRM stack or EUC governance stack.
Could I just give you my opinion from experience? And obviously, I sit within the first line currently, and I think models is an interesting area at the moment, because for end user computing is, again, I don't want to emphasize a point, but the end tool in markets environment will be relying on obviously these models being integrated, but that's not the same for all of the banks. So for me, and the way in which the organization tackles models versus end user computing, they're two separate policies. But I echo again what Igor was saying, in that you can't separate them. Models are becoming more and more intertwined with end user computing and all of the coding languages, etc. In a framework, though, in the beginning, you have to define what the end user computing application is. So for building a framework from scratch, from experience, it would be very much easier to focus on the results of the end user computing tool and hive out the model risk policy, because that's something that's going to get very complicated very quickly. So for the framework, from building it from scratch up, I would, from experience, be focusing more on the results of the spreadsheets, the fields, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I think that echoes the regulatory commentary that I talked to on the last earlier on the last slide. I think moving on from the definition, obviously, Igor, maybe we could talk about how once we have the definition in place, how we then move to sort of pulling that together into some form of policy for an organization. Oh, sorry, Igor, I think we're...
So clearly unmuting helps. So the reason that we try to be precise with definition what's in or what's out, because we really want to make sure that the organization has a chance to focus their efforts on the highest risk exposure, right? To have very much risk-driven mindset. And with that in mind, what we see quite often is when you look at the very broad spectrum of what constitutes an EUCs, it's not necessarily that you want to include all of them to the same level of stringent controls, right? So one of the ways to tackle it from practical perspective for the organization is to step back and to start thinking about what are my key uses, right? How do I make money? What's my largest exposure? What we have on a page, it's not a complete or exhaustive list, but maybe just help some of the organizations to think through what would be the key uses for them. And once you define key uses, then it gets interesting because now you know certain EUCs which are aligned to your key processes, key activities, and then you can start risk ranking your EUCs. And why are we proposing risk ranking right at that stage? Because then it will help you to define your control expectations. What we're trying to position is that control expectations for top tier risk for the EUC should be probably more stringent. So you probably will have different controls and more frequent controls for EUCs that belong to the high risk level versus something that's much more benign. And probably in the next couple of minutes, we can chat about what makes high risk versus low risk, but let me stop and gauge, Chris, Henry, your reaction to what I just described.
I can give you an initial consideration. Igor, that's exactly how we started the framework. One aspect that I think maybe I just kind of word into my language is the impact. So I recognize most of those key uses in there, but it's weighting the impact from a kind of ORM perspective. And one recommendation that I think held us in good stead from when we were audited, etc., was linking the impact of these spreadsheets to the thresholds that we've set in our ORM GRC kind of environment. Because then you're aligned as an organization. And what that also then enables you to do is to cater for regional deviations, departmental deviations, because potentially a spreadsheet that is used by, let's deem it a support department, may not have as much impact as something that is used for a pricing spreadsheet. So you can cater for the thresholds and then feed that into, as you say, your EUC inventory. And I agree, the way in which you onboard these and rate these is probably the most or equally as critical to the controls that you implement and say high, medium, and low, or depending on whatever category you use.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Chris, sorry, Hendrik, go ahead.
No, carry on, please, Igor.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what you just brought up is very relevant to this discussion because it helps us to think through the spectrum of high, medium, and low. So, Henry, I don't know if that's the right time, but if maybe we can move on to the next slide, then maybe we can chat a little bit, just to show you one of the views, how you would consider what makes high, medium, and low. And the view here is quite traditional coming from the operational risk management world, right? You would look at the impact and you look at the likelihood. When it gets, when you think about impact, it's somewhat straightforward, right? You look at the inherent exposure, and your inherent exposure will be quantitative or qualitative, depending upon the function, department, business line, etc. Right? And Chris, something that you mentioned, it's great to have very clear thresholds, right? So what makes high, medium, and low? And it's likely for complex global organizations, you will have more than one threshold. So high, medium, low for your sales and trading likely will look quite different from your wealth management or from your operations department. Yeah, but when it gets really interesting is when you start thinking about the frequency, right? So, impact times frequency. So how would you assess frequency part of the equation. So one way is that we are proposing for folks to think about is look at the specific attributes of that object that we're discussing, right? What makes this object different from the rest of the objects in your inventory? And one way to think about it is look at the complexity. So thinking of complexity, naturally, it will be, if it's a, simple plain Excel file, or if there's certain coding languages being used, then what the complexity of the coding language. Then you would look perhaps on the number of external inputs that the file needs, that the computation nature that's being involved, how many internal references. So that helps you to define the complexity of the specific object. But then there's an additional factor on the operations. And the way you would think about it, a couple of those we present on the page. You look at number of users, how frequently it's being used, and additional factors that we suggest include is the change management. If this object, how frequently this object is being changed, right? Because thinking through that, if something that's being used by many people and being changed, monthly, perhaps has high likelihood of errors versus something that's being used maybe by a handful of folks and being touched maybe once a year. Let me stop and see.
Yeah,
Henry, Chris, what would you like to add?
So Igor, there's just kept picking up on a couple of those points. The frequency of change is an interesting one. Also, the scope of the change of an EUC. So I'm remembering one client who's had sort of 10 finance heads, of which 9 of them had well-structured spreadsheets that there was a lot of operational input and interaction with them during the month. However, one of them was effectively rewriting the spreadsheet each month because it wasn't very well structured. So what that obviously introduced was a far greater operational risk. Which again, from just picking up on that last point, I think another couple of areas that probably are not quite covered here are key man risk. So again, what you typically find, and we found a number of organizations is, there a lot of the EUCs are reliant on one coder or one key developer who's created these spreadsheets. We have actually met people where that person has left, and there is little understanding of how those EUCs actually really work. And that it is literally there's a script which you update, input here, update that, press calculate, and that's the results, which gets a little bit scary. But again, that key man risk should be identified, but also expanding from that departmental risk. So are there some departments are far more reliant, or certain areas of the bank that are more reliant on EUCs, and therefore again that's just adding to that operational risk. I know, Chris, if you've got any thoughts.
I would just like to pick you up on that last point, because sometimes I think this slide is actually really useful, but there's some kind of variations in there that may be just helpful for the conversation. But obviously, you have to have a control. If an end user computing is relied upon by multiple departments, you have to somehow document that control of the data source. That data source may be a database, it may be another spreadsheet that's fed by another database. So having those chain of events influences the impact of maybe operational risk. But again, it could have an impact on financial risk, because if you're just seeing a simple end user computing, which might be a GUI in the front end, it may have all of these financial impacts from an internal database that then influence the external. So again, I want to reemphasize, it's not a one-dimensional validation of a spreadsheet. You have to consider the inputs, because again, really financial impact usually obviously can cause a lot of damage to an organization. It causes damage to the reputation of the organization with clients, etc. But there's also reputational damage, and that one can't be underestimated. So if you don't know the formulas and what the impact of moving certain fields and data fields, it can be quite catastrophic, shall we say.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think that most people we talk to, it's the regulatory and reputation, either the reputation to the regulator, or if to Igor's point, if it's in in client facing, so wealth management, that the reputational impact to your clients, that these simple IT controls are not there, can have far more devastating effect on the organization than the actual financial impact.
And just to add to that, most people, when talking about end user computing, are thinking about themselves and maybe one other organization who they're interfacing with, but potentially this has a market-wide impact depending on the use of the end user computing, which then hits you financially, operationally, and reputationally, which then automatically becomes a high in my books. But you have to consider these potential impacts greatly. Yeah. It's something that you need to kind of document early on.
Absolutely. So I think I think this is, as we've all said, this is a key area to make sure that we fully understand all the dimensions of the risk, fully documented. Once we've got that tiering in place, it's really then about the implementation of control to ensure that we mitigate. We start mitigating those risks. So again, Igor, we keep coming to you first. Maybe would you again like to just sort of set the scene for us on some of the control standards that you've seen in the market?
Thank you, Henry. I'll be happy to. And again, the underlying premise there is there is no cliff nature of risk, right? It's a sliding nature of risks. So we need to make sure that the controls align to the risk exposure, but at the same time, we fully appreciate that you cannot apply exactly the same control portfolio to each and every EUC. So breaking it down by tiers is one of the practical approaches that we see works well for the organization when you're able really to demonstrate the alignment of activities to the risk exposure. So if we are in agreement for that part, then make step back and think about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. What makes tier 1 EUC is so high risk? Really a combination of a couple of factors. So it's inherent risk of the process that it supports, inherent risk of the EUC, but as well as complexity. So likely what I want to do for the tier 1 is to bring level of controls which I wouldn't need for tier 3. So specifically controls that are related to validation of computations, validations of formulas, etc., making sure that the tier 1 EUC performs exactly as expected. So using the same logic, if we think about the risk exposure for the other two tiers, and we look back on the actual underlying risks, so risks related to development and implementation, and risk to operations resulting from operations, then naturally you would expect controls related to documentation to be more prevalent for the top tiers of the EUCs versus controls such as expected baseline controls related to access management, related to inventory, etc., would be applicable to all EUCs in the inventory.
Igor, that's just to ask one question and maybe what you see in the market, but when we were looking at the frameworks, documentation was one aspect that we kind of considered last. You're trying to hurry around, trying to work out your inventory, but documentation, who are you writing the documentation for was the kind of consideration we had internally. A trader in markets might write a couple of lines, but that might not be good enough for a functional tester to come in and understand what the spreadsheet is trying to achieve. So again, adhering to the internal ORC is something that maybe is applicable here and something to consider early, because you don't want to get an inventory and have to go back and then redocument to a standard that you're not aware of. So I would just like to point that out as well.
Mm-hmm. If I may, maybe to jump in for a second here, is there is nothing wrong with traders writing a couple of lines. That's great.
Of course.
We just need to be mindful how would the final documentation, what would be the documentation expectations for each EUC?
Exactly.
And likely, and then we will talk about in a minute probably about roles and responsibilities. But conceptually, what you would see that the role of EUC owner, EUC developer, that will be somewhat related. Then we also expect role of EUC supervisor. So I think it's very much responsibility on the first line. And again, it varies by the institution, but it's very much on the first line to make sure that the documentation captures what you need to know about EUCs for a couple of different reasons. One is, as you mentioned, risk management, right? People should be able to independently validate and confirm that EUC is performing as expected. But then another topic, Chris, you mentioned, I think a few minutes ago, or Henry, maybe it was you, about key person risk. Well, documentation will allow you, right? If, for example, you have a business continuity control fails, then documentation might allow you to recreate the EUC, or maybe to recreate the capability in somewhat similar fashion. Going back, I guess, to some of the foundational questions, documentation really needs to be part. The standard documentation really needs to be part of the framework. We fully appreciate that the granularity of documentation will vary. So documentation for level 1 probably will be much more detailed, much more granular. That documentation then for level 2, some organizations decide not to make documentation for level 3 mandatory, and that's really, risk-taking decision on how much value versus hurdle we asking the first line to deliver. But again, documentation is a requirement, is expected requirement from the framework, with full expectation that likely the level granularity will vary depending upon the risk level of the specific object you're trying to capture.
Yeah, and I think I think there's two key things to take away from here. One is the proportionality of the controls. So it is definitely dependent, and if you listen to the regulators when they talk about this, it is dependent on that risk ranking. So we have heard we've met clients who just applied a bland all controls must apply to all EUCs, which is a very self-harming approach to it. So the regulators expect that proportional approach, and I think if you go back to the OCC model handbook, again, what tends to scare people when addressing EUC risk, if you've come from a sort of a model governance world, and then you try and look at the EUC world, you do not need to have the same control framework that you have for models applied to EUCs. And what we have on the slide here from Igor is basically showing that the types of controls you need and how they can proportionally be applied depending on that risk tier. And it is important. And I think I would just echo what Chris said is certainly around EUCs, I think the documentation is probably one of the last things that does get included in that control framework. It is trying to get some of these other things in place first, and then I guess really starting on the tier ones, getting some of that documentation in place. I think just in the interest of time, Igor, as you said, I think one of the key things here is with all of these controls, as I say, it can be quite daunting. But I think if we look at the division of labor, different roles and responsibilities. I mean, maybe Chris, would you like to start first on sort of your views on how you see those roles and responsibilities and how people are involved in that EUC risk agenda?
Sure. So framework, I guess the initiative started internally for us from an audit point, basically stating that we didn't have control over our landscape. Let's leave it there. And one of the key elements there was we don't know what tools are being used within the front office. The audit point was wider. We took it upon ourselves to kind of control this element. At the time, we didn't have like budget to go out and build all of these tools. So we thought, okay, let's work out what we've got out there in the landscape. That very much for us was a first line responsibility. I think it's key here to define what first line is for us. Compliance and risk type functions, overseeing type functions, second line, audit, third line, but anybody that's a business type user and part of the business franchise would be deemed first line here. So I include back office in a banking organization as well as front office. Within the first line, it was very difficult at first to know where to start because initially you don't know if traders or salespeople have got it on their C drive, whether it's here, whether it's in their email, how they use versioning control. So you have to come up before you start, because otherwise you're going to be chasing your tail. You have to come up with a structure. You have to come up with, okay, how am I going to get a version of my inventory? So there's many ways you can do that, and each organization will pick that route. For us, we decided we would put a central repository and give people an X period of time to put the spreadsheets in there. And at that point, the bank would protect them, because we were kind of then building inventory. Anything outside of that area, we would say, if something went wrong and you were still using that version, then you may have an issue if it caused regulatory impact, et cetera, et cetera. So for us, it was quite nice way to lead into building an inventory.
Yeah.
To flip forwards, then I think teams like second line functions have been a bit, I'm not going to say slower, but have been waiting on us to build the inventory and to get control of our world before they then come in and start thinking about independent testing, oversight, checking how we've ranked, do our kind of weightings make sense in our kind of onboarding questionnaires, etc. And I think now, as the time has evolved, I very much see that as the key function here. If you've got a streamlined process for onboarding and people know how to onboard it, that's quite an easy process. But the independent testing, governance, questioning is equally as important as first line. I don't really consider the third line here, that's audit. They got their own kind of timeframes, and they come in and give you kind of guidance once every now and then, and obviously EUC should be part of their agenda at the beginning of the year, on depending on how they lead up. But for me, I would emphasize that first line and second line have to be entwined now. It shouldn't be seen as a separate function. They have to be working together to govern the inventory against the organization's policy. I'll leave it there because I could talk all day on that.
So, Igor, maybe would you like to give your commentary on the roles and responsibilities? Yeah.
Of course. So the underlying premise, and Chris, I can't agree. I can't agree with you anymore that that they really should be working very, very closely with each other. And the view, how would you tackle it perhaps for the organization, is to have an understanding of what's the risk taking versus risk oversight. Because at the end of the day, by and large, EUCs are created to solve a specific business problem. Business problem usually, resides with the risk takers. So when you think about the risk takers, when you think about first line, one of the views perhaps is to separate between the EUC owner, EUC developer, and then the first line control function, right? So we refer to them as business control officers. But in reality, they have quite distinct roles in the organization. So when you're thinking about the business developer, those are the folks who know, they have the most intimate knowledge of the EUCs. They know they're in best position to assess the EUC complexity, etc. Working very closely with EUC owners, if those are two different organizations, helps them to define the inherent risk, etc. So they're the ones who are responsible not only for creating EUCs, but also for implementing those EUCs and to capturing them in the inventory and in conducting initial risk assessment. But then it gets interesting, because then there is a role of EUC supervisor, and different organizations will have different names for the role. So it's really more of a concept than the title, so to speak. But then the EUC supervisor should be able to assess the need for the EUC, right? Whether there is no other way to deliver the same capability, perhaps working with third-party organization or perhaps going to IT department. But having said that, if the need for EUC has been confirmed, then making sure that the risk assessment was done properly. And then as you go up the governance chain, you get better and better visibility on the execution of the control framework, whether all of the EUCs are really entered into the inventory, and whether risk assessment is consistent. But then it gets to the second line, and now they're all slightly changed, because they not only want to make sure that the inventory is being updated, they're also now in position to see whether the risk mitigation strategies are applied consistently across the enterprise. And when we mention risk mitigation strategies, those are not the only periodic controls that we mentioned, but also the whole notion of decommissioning, decommissioning, retirement, etc., is being applied based on the predefined criteria. And they are naturally the ones who likely will be conducting independent validation for high-risk activities, updating policies, and so forth. Henry, back to you.
Yeah, no, well, Igor, I think that fantastic. I think you both have teed up the next two sessions beautifully, insofar as we're going to be talking about tips for building that inventory. So I think, in summary, for what this has been a fantastic session. I think we've been able to explain sort of the risks the definition, the policies, the sort of how we should, the risks we should consider in categorizing our EUCs. We've touched now on the roles and responsibilities, and really the next step in the journey, really, once we've now framed our terms of reference is really to operationalize this. And the core of that is going to be bringing an inventory together. And once the inventory together, we'll get onto our third webinar, which is the implementation of the controls, and then really hopefully delivering that transformation agenda, which Igor, you talked about, which is that decommissioning. So, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time today on this, and look forward to seeing you on the next edition of the second in our 3 webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.